This morning we have 7 verses from the 7th book of our New Testament, from the final chapter of one of Paul's longest letters. And I want you to begin by standing with me to honor the word of our God as I read from 1 Corinthians 16, starting with verse 12. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to visit you with the other brothers, but it was not at all his will to come now. He will come when he has opportunity. Be watchful. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. Now I urge you, brothers, you know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. Be subject to such as these, and to every fellow worker and laborer. I rejoice at the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, because they have made up for your absence, for they refreshed my spirit as well as yours. Give recognition to such people. Please be seated. Now, if we're observant, we know that this passage does not contain a lot of grand theology. In fact, it doesn't mention God even once. And actually, chapter 16 is, it's like our announcements at the end of our service. That's not where we try to go deep. Sorry, Randy, but that's not where we introduce new theology. It's when we check ourselves in the mirror before we head out the door. So what are we up to? What kinds of things are we doing? If the stuff we've been learning about and singing about is true and good, then, what do we do now? What kinds of things are going on? And that's all important, because that informs our feet where they ought to go if our head and our heart is learning what really matters. So that's what chapter 16 is all about. The announcements. So for 15 chapters, Paul has been systematically unmasking the creepy bugs that infest the church at Corinth. He's sort of God's exterminator. He's hoping that these readers then will take to heart what he has shared, that stuff he's just unloaded on them, and start to clean house, take action. So now he gets to chapter 16. And if they take to heart God's call to unity through Paul, then they're going to take action by participating in the collection for the suffering Jews in Jerusalem, Gentiles helping Jews. So as we learned last week, that's how Paul started this 16th chapter, this chapter of announcements. And so the first thing he says is, don't forget the offering. Why? Because unity is important. And at the end of the chapter, where we are headed next week, and it's going to help us get through the end of this series, Paul wants them to take to heart the call to love. We had it in chapter 13, maybe the highlight of the whole book, but in many places throughout the book. Now, if they take that to heart, then they will take action by receiving and giving love, even exchanging holy kisses. Don't miss next week. And then more than anything, by prioritizing their love for the Lord. There's this powerful verse at the end. If anyone has no love for the Lord, let him be accursed. That's pretty tough language. And Paul is saying, then when you leave here today, you're finishing my long letter, and you've read it, and then you re-roll it, and you return it to its shelf. When you've done that, I want you to find somebody to love, because you love Jesus. And I love you. That's next Sunday. Now today we're in the middle part of the chapter of these farewell announcements. And there are 3 little parts to this middle part of our 7 verses, and they start with Apollos in verse 12. So let's go to that, and let's just look at that. There's just one verse here that talks about Apollos, and I'm going to call this whole part, Visits Worth Having. Now, concerning our brother Apollos, do you remember who Apollos was? Mighty in the Old Testament. He'd been in Corinth. They all knew him. They had a party, a sect or a kind of a group or division that said, we are the champions of Apollos. So he says, I strongly urged him to come to you, to visit you with the other brothers. Now, the occasion might have been the return of the 3 Christian brothers from Corinth that had been visiting Paul. They're mentioned in the last verse of this section that we just read. Paul wants Apollos to go back with them and be there because Paul is a big fan of Apollos and the ability that he had to build Scripture into people. And Corinth needed that in a big way. But look, Paul brings Apollos up only to tell the church that he's not coming. You know, some of those people might have said, we want him to come. They requested a visit because they loved him. And I suppose it's good that Paul just keeps them in the loop. Sometimes that's all an announcement is for, so we know what's going on. But I believe there's more to this, a unity thing. And so the underlying point I want you to write down here is this. You need the help of key leaders like Apollos, but you dare not divide the church over exclusive loyalty to one over the other. Now, where do I get that last part? Well, Paul wants them to know that if they're trying to promote Paul over Apollos or Apollos over Paul, that neither he nor Apollos want any part of that game. Paul is not reluctant. In fact, he is strongly desirous. He's strongly urged. He repeatedly twisted Apollos' arm to get him to go to Corinth. But why would he do that? Because Paul is not afraid that Apollos is going to get there and steal sheep from Paul. Because they don't have sheep. Only Jesus has sheep. And then on Apollos' part, he is not anxious to go. So I urged him to visit you, and then it says, but it was not at all his will to come now. And so if Apollos were into building his own fan base with Paul out of the way down there in Ephesus, he would have been eager to visit Corinth. But no, they're not competing with each other. One plants, one waters. We heard that in earlier chapters, but Apollos doesn't want to go, at least not now. Not that he hates the Corinthians. He's going to go when he can. He will come when he has opportunity. When it's a better time for it, whatever that means, he doesn't explain. So here's the first thing that we learn from Paul. He wants them to have whatever ministry will be good for them, but not at the expense of unity. It doesn't matter who it comes from. They really need some help, even if it comes later rather than sooner. Now, the question would be, where does that leave the church in the meantime? They need Apollos, but, well, let's just say they're on their own. And we get in verses 13 and 14 a whole new twist to this. They need what a personal visit from Apollos would give to them, biblical grounding, maturity. But if they must make do in the meantime without that level of help for now, Paul is quick to remind them what they need to do. And he exhorts them with 5 quick reminders that add up to this. Step up and be the best you can be. The proverbial boot and the proverbial breeches. Here's the underlying point. You need leaders. Do you ever? But all of you men have the responsibility to make sure your families and church are able to thrive. To do that, you've got to do a lot better. You've got to step it up. You've got to wake up, be watchful, stand firm in the faith. In fact, these are the negation of almost all the problems that had happened in Corinth. And then he says, be strong. Grow stronger and stronger. Let all that you do be done in love. And love was the big, big gap that was there in Corinth. And why, if they would have had that, probably nothing bad would have happened that we see in those previous 15 chapters. Now, these 2 verses may be an example of formal letter structure, where they were expected in those days to sign off with some kind of parting counsel, preferably of the pithy sort. But I think that these 5 things are no formality. They're sort of like a dad who is heading off to war, getting his young sons around the fire and saying, look, I'm being deployed, so you guys, you're going to have to step up and be the men around here. You be the men of the house, okay? And when I'm gone, don't let anything happen to your mom. Put on your big boy pants and make sure that she knows she's safe at night, because you're ready for anything. Wash your car. Make sure that the oil is changed on time. You sort of get the scene here. Make sure you guys are always in church. And you could go on and on, I suppose, but you're the gatekeepers. You're going to be pace setters. You're old enough to do this. In short, it boils down to 5 things, guys. Write these down, hold each other accountable, pin them on your wall. I'm going to make this very simple because you're my soldiers. While I'm over there fighting, you're my soldiers here. And so here are your orders. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, Act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. These are orders, I call these orders worth following. Now we're going to come back to these later. So these are going to be the real push of our message and the application of it. And these are especially for the men of the church. It's hard to imagine that Paul would ask the women to act like men, literally act like males. Hardly any women are interested in that anyway. But anyway, he's putting these men on notice. And I imagine it's hard for these men to read this letter. I mean, it's chock full of the church's shortcomings, and they have to feel ashamed. I see it sort of like Adam hiding out after he and Eve had sinned. You know, the fig leaf deal. God came to the garden, called out to him, to Adam. I mean, not to Eve, even though she was the first one to eat. The heartbroken father called out, Adam, where are you? I hear Paul echoing God's voice. Well, what's the deal with you guys? Something's got to change. When the church started to squabble over its favorite leader, where were you guys? How'd you let that happen? You can't let that happen anymore. When the guy sinned so horribly, incest of all things, where were you? Where were you when some of the brothers started to take each other to court? You couldn't step in and help them? Find a way to be reconciled? Not one of you? Couldn't you see what was happening? No, you had your eyes closed. It's time to wake up. Be watchful, he says. That means wake up and stay awake. Man, you guys got to be doing better, or this church is in trouble. It is in trouble, and it's not going to change. May not even survive. Well, we're going to come back to those 5 commands. Well, then Paul takes up their attitude towards church leaders, and he describes people worth honoring. And the underlying point here is simply this: your efforts to be strong, and I want you to be strong, but they have to be balanced by a willingness to submit to those who are showing the heart of humble service. That is, those that are serving you in such a way that they ought to be your leaders. You submit to them. And so he says in verse 15, now I urge you, brothers, talking to the men again, and these obviously, almost all the commands that say brothers, you could say brothers and sisters, but I think here especially he's focusing again on the men because they don't necessarily want to submit to anybody. So he says, I urge you, brothers, you know that the household of Stephanas, by the way, you could pronounce that Stephanos, I don't care, but anyway, same guy. Anyway, he has a household and of various people in his house that are all serving together. So they all know Stephanos and his family. Charter members of the church. He says that they were the first converts in Achaia, the first converts, the first fruits. But here's the important thing, not just the fact that they have been Christians a fair amount of time, longer than others in that congregation, maybe 4 years tops, that's not very much. What if a congregation was made only of people that had been saved 4 years or less? How many of you, raise your hand if you've been saved 4 years or less, if you can think back. Okay, there's a few of you, a lot, almost all of you have been more. You're so very recent, yeah. Well, bless the Lord. But it wasn't how long they had been Christians really that he calls attention to it, as how they served, as sincere followers of Jesus. So he says, and that they have devoted themselves, let me bring that up there, and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. They minister to the needs of people as humble servants. All the readers can testify to this. She says, you know this. So how should you treat them? People like this, should you walk all over these suckers because you can take advantage of them? Or, more to the point here in this letter, should you downplay them as leaders because maybe they aren't church celebrities like Paul or Peter or Apollos. They're just our local dudes. No, he says, be subject to such as these. Submit to them. Their example, their teaching, their direction. Look how they serve you. Put yourself under their authority. And not only to them, to Stephanas' household or family, but to every fellow worker and laborer. And so that includes all your humble ministers who work so hard but don't seem to attract any fan clubs in your church. You just want the big dudes. But, because that's just like my old neighbor who's now a Christian and now he's serving like this, one of my ministers or leaders, just doing the grunt work of the congregation. He says, yeah, submit to them. Paul is teaching a principle that is applied wherever you see Christian servants at work. Submit to them humbly. And then briefly at the end of our section, another announcement about comings and goings. He says, I rejoice, this is my delight. at the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, these good brothers from Corinth had come to visit Paul. He's in Ephesus. I don't know why, possibly carrying a gift from the church, or at least encouragement. And of course, seemed to have brought news about some of the problems back in Corinth. And so he says, I rejoice. And you can see how Paul, here he is, this pretty amazing suffering apostle, this theologian of sorts. He is truly a people person. He longs for the people that he can't be with, and he rejoices when he gets to see them and hear anything about the people that he cares about. And so his main point is that people like these three men, a couple of them possibly converted slaves, men who go out of their way to help spread the gospel, that they are worthy of honor from the church. Give recognition, he says, to such people. So let's highlight that whole verse and look at the very end. Give recognition to such people. And so that means that the church should acknowledge, should appreciate their service and them, be grateful that you have men like this in your midst, take notice of them, point them out. Paul may even mean that you should support them financially as needed. So that describes people worth honoring. Some are devoted to ministering within the body. Others make sacrifices to extend the gospel outside the church, in this case, helping Paul out where he is. And some people do both. If you honor those people and the things they do, you honor stuff you want to see more of, because it's essential for a healthy church. The path to honor, we know, is not crown grabbing and crowd pleasing and all of that. It is foot washing. It's serving the saints. Well, now I'm ready to talk to us men about the middle verses 13 and 14. And for myself, I find these verses very convicting. Now, normal men that I know are not fond of having their faults revealed. Anyone that's not like that, you can leave now. You don't need this message. But so when that happens, we get defensive, or we make excuses like Adam did. It was the woman that you gave me. We don't like someone making us feel small, not even God. Well, for 15 chapters, Paul has been revealing the faults of this church, and that mostly comes down on its men. And it had to be humiliating to be read out like that, like the way this letter does, in front of all the women and children. Look what a mess you guys are allowing in this church. This is shameful. But what I love about these middle verses is that they are all positive. Not negative. Not one negative is to be found. Paul doesn't say how much these men have screwed up. Although I guess you could read between the lines when you have to tell somebody to wake up, it implies that they have been sleeping at the switch. Or when he says you got to be strong, it implies that they've been too weak. But Paul doesn't say it like that. He just makes it very positive. And he tells these guys precisely how they need to act if anything is going to really improve in their church. Now, several times I have used these two verses with their 5 commands to challenge the men in Liberia to restore the heart of their nation. And the first time I shared this message, they weren't finished firing bullets and lobbing bombs at each other. Their nation was in chaos. It was a first-class crisis. And yet, even today, they're past the shooting by over 10 years. Even today, Liberia is economically depressed, one of this world's poorest nations. Hardly any man has a paying job. The nation is hungry, it's diseased, it's dirty, it's nearly illiterate, it's corrupt. It's broken and fragile and is desperate for leadership. But above all, it is spiritually impoverished. It has hundreds of churches, but little truth. False doctrines flourish there like summer zucchinis on steroids. And when I remind them of these things, I add one other fact everyone sees. They all agree, to their shame. There are many powerful women of faith in this country, and comparatively few men who have an unshreddable walk with God. Yet everybody in Liberia, they want to see their nation rise out of the ashes of civil war. And they may think that would happen when they finally get the best great president, and they have a new one, George Weah, a great soccer player, voted the world's best player, but I don't think he's the world's best president. Or they might think when the water and the electricity finally get turned on and the garbage starts being collected regularly, then we'll finally pull out of it. But the fact is that the number one need for the restoration of a nation is the same as what was needed to restore the church in Corinth. And it is men who humbly turn to God and take up their God-given role in their family, their church, and their community. The strength needed comes down to men and how they walk with their God. Now, I'm not saying that weak men is the only way a family or a church or a community can be weak, but it's far and away the most common reason. Now, this is not at all to disregard the strong work of women. In Liberia, some of them, of course, lost their husbands in the war. They had to be the go-to leader in their homes. And so often they do valiantly. But too often, the men in Liberia who are still in the home, they have just dropped the ball. They have no job, and yet they sit on the porch all day and they watch the world float by. And when I share these observations in Africa, they all agree. And they admit the men are weak. And so the nation has little hope until the men step up. The church has little hope until the men step up. Will you be the judge how much this is true here in America or here in our church? One obvious problem is that when the men are fumbling and the women have to rise up and carry the ball, who is actually teaching the boys of a new generation how to be real men of faith? How is that actually playing out in your own family? Who in your family is making sure you get to church every week and you learn God's word? Who is guarding the gate when it comes to what you watch in your home? Who really seems to really care about the things of God? Is it dad? Or does it usually come down to mom? Where are you, Adam? Now, I'm not sharing this exhortation because I think this room is full of men who are washing out. Far from it. You may have noticed that this church does not have the failures of the church at Corinth. And not that we're perfect in that, I'm not suggesting that. But we have substantial health. And the reason for that is, first of all, the grace of God, obviously. But it's a testimony to the strength of our men and their families, and I must add the women of devotion. And I'm full of admiration for how well I see FBC men doing, taking up their duties and privileges as men. And of course, I don't know some of you, but I look up to so many that I know, and I wish that I did as well as you. And yes, I know my own lacks, and you know some of yours. I'm not unaware that the devil constantly tries to undermine, immobilize, neutralize the influence of good men. And that's why every man here, married or not, doing well or not, needs this passage this morning. It's just 21 words. It's only 12 in Greek. But it speaks volumes to a man's heart if he will listen. 5 commands, all in the present tense, which means 2 things. Don't wait to start and then never stop. And so here's the first thing that Paul says: stand watch and keep it up even in the darkest hour of the night. Why? So you will detect the enemy when he comes. Your adversary never sleeps. Now, God's men are on high alert because the enemy is constantly prowling around looking for someone to devour, like you and your family. Now, there's something in every man that knows part of being a man is staying awake and watching for danger. He knows that we're in a battle, so he doesn't say to his wife and his kids, I need some sleep. You guys watch for the enemy. His spirit knows what's right here, but alas, his flesh is weak. Think about the disciples who couldn't watch and pray when Jesus was in Gethsemane's garden. They were snoring through their beards when their Savior was sweating blood and tears. And too many today are just like those sleeping disciples, and they sort of believe a lie. A lie that goes like this: everything will be okay without me. They don't need me that much. Let me sleep. But God's man keeps his eyes wide open, even if everyone else nods off. Such a man was Jesus Christ. You wonder about today's males, the temptation we have to sort of get taken by surprise and then run away when we ought to stand and be brave, sort of like the disciples. They all fled when their master was dragged off for torture, mockery, and nails. Disciples, they couldn't stand firm because they didn't stand watch. We could say it like this: you'll never stay if you don't pray. And yet we come by this naturally. Think about it. There was another male, the very first male, Mr. Adam. He's in another garden back in Genesis. He allows the serpent to approach his wife. Now, there's no indication that Adam even noticed. It appears that he stood there silent, asleep on his watch. And we could pause for a moment of grief because that was criminal. And it touches everyone in this room. God's men don't let that happen. They watch. And that doesn't mean they're a spectator like Adam. They see the dangers that threaten their family and their church and their nation. They see danger coming from the world and the flesh and the devil, and they don't make their wives blow the alarm trumpet. They don't believe the lie that things will be okay without them doing their part, even if all that they can do is warn and pray. They see themselves as a gatekeeper. And a gatekeeper asks probing questions. What kind of things are my kids going to encounter on the streets, in the classrooms, that I need to warn them about, prepare them for, on the screen, wherever it comes from? What do I need to protect them from? And do I have a plan to maximize their physical, even financial, and spiritual safety? These people who depend on me. And am I aware of the pressures that are threatening my wife? What can I do to stand between her and the things that would defeat her? God's man is aware of principalities and powers. He knows his family needs him to watch and to pray. God is looking for a man like this. Will you be that man? Where are you, Adam? Paul goes on to tell us something else about God's men, that they are not only on high alert, but they are men of endurance. Paul doesn't tell us to keep watch so we would know how to run away, but so that we will stand up and surrender no ground, stand firm in the faith, never give ground. Your convictions are always being tested, the faith, what you supposedly say you believe. Now, why do so many men give up the battle? Well, they believe another little lie that Adam apparently believed in the garden after he sinned. He said, God won't be there for me, so I need to hide and maneuver myself where things will still go okay for me. He began to define his life without God in it, outside God's presence and God's desires, and having a right relationship with him. And so he invented fig leaves in order to try to make that happen. This kind of man hasn't drawn a line in the sand for his family and said, we don't cross over this line. These are my convictions. In other words, he has never worked out the biblical standards that will govern his family. And you could go on and list these, but let's just say it like this in our family: because God says so, we don't do a lot of things. We don't cheat. We don't lie. We don't take God's name in vain. We don't covet what others have. We don't allow sensual dressing and foul language. We don't forsake the assembly of the saints. We give and we reach out, and we don't let the world cram us into its mold. We just don't. Well, God is looking for a man with high convictions that he won't compromise. He believes in stuff that is non-negotiable, and his family knows it. He believes God is real, and he's present, and it shows in every decision he makes. And if you know this man well, you see that he's not out for a name for himself. He is out for the glory of God. And so at the center of his heart is a delight in God. He establishes in his heart that God is greater than he is. And God must be served. And he loves to think about the cross, where his God came that close to him as a sinner, to be identified with him as a man who deserved death. And then when this man suffers, you see how he trusts God's sovereignty, that God will permit nothing that would forfeit ultimate blessing. He keeps on rejoicing because he knows that suffering is not an accident, but a plan. And so he prays instead of complaining and worrying. He knows that God hears him when he prays. And he knows that God will never let him go and never let him down. And he loves the gospel of a dying and rising Savior. And he is convinced that people have to believe that gospel to be saved, and he is not ashamed to tell people about it. And so he makes sacrifices, both to learn the word of God and to spread that word across this world. And he knows he can't do any of that alone, so he also knows he needs other people, and they need him. He knows the value of women, and he treats them with dignity. He makes vows to his wife that he will not break. He won't leave her. He won't cheat on her. He won't let her down like Adam let Eve down. You know, when Satan asks, has God said to Eve, Adam should have stood tall and said something. And he says, hey, wait a minute. God has said, I heard him with my own ears, even though evidently it was heard before Eve was created. It says, but I heard it, and what's it to you, you stinking viper? Are you insinuating that God is withholding something from us that we truly need from him? Go take it up with him, but in the meantime, stay away from my wife. God's good man also makes a covenant with his kids. He won't leave them. He will always love them. He'll always do the best he can to care for them. And they know it. I love the story of the family that went to a rural area and was staying by a lake. One bright morning, the mother was caring for the baby and getting some lunch together, and the dad was preparing the boat for fishing. 3 older children were playing on the lawn between the house and the lake's edge. 3-year-old little Billy, and he was under the care of his 5-year-old sister and 12-year-old cousin. Now, when the sister and the cousin got distracted, little Billy went wandering, exploring near the water, too near. He waddled out onto the dock, in fact, and he fell in, but he could not swim. The cousin heard the splash, let out a scream, and the father, came in on the run, looked at the situation, and then he dived into the murky water, began a desperate search for his little boy. But the dark water made it impossible to see a thing. With lungs crying for air, he burst to the surface, grabbed another gulp of air. Down he went again as panic started in. Nearly exhausting his air, a second time he began to ascend for another breath. On his way up, he felt little Billy, who was locked in a death grip to the dock's piling more than 4 feet underwater. The dad pried the boy's fingers loose, and then they burst together to the water, to the life-saving air. Heart pumping, the dad discovered that his little son was okay. He just carried that little guy around and around, holding him safe, hating to think what had just about happened to his precious little guy. Well, when their hearts stopped pumping and calmed down a little, they could talk. And this loving dad looked down at his boy with a question. Billy, what on earth were you doing down there, hanging onto that post so far underwater? And the little Billy's answer was filled with the innocence of a trusting tot. Just waiting for you, Daddy. Just waiting for you. Well, that kid knew that his father could be relied on to keep the faith, to fulfill his commitments. God is looking for men like this. They know what they believe, and they stick by God's truth, and they honor their promises no matter what, even when they are severely tested. Will you be that man? Where are you, Adam? So, stand watch and stand firm. But this is not men standing around all the time. There must be a time to act on the dangers you see and the beliefs you claim, like the dad at the lake. There's a time to take it to the enemy. Act like a male. Take bold action. People are depending on you. Now, there's nothing passive here to this man. God's men are men of action. They take bold initiative as needed. The command is just one word, the word male made into a verb. We don't really have anything equivalent to this in English. Maybe something like man up. Put your masculine strength to work. And some translations just turn it into a call for courage, which I think kind of loses the point here, because men and women can have courage, but he's talking to men. Be males. I mean, do what men do best. Bring it to the stadium of life and take the fight to the enemy. Enough of this religion is for women or the feminization of the church. Don't get me off on that. Or what they call toxic masculinity. The thing that gets toxic about men is when they try to be powerful as a matter of pride, and they care only about themselves or what people think of them. That's a perversion of the divine design. And it turns men into guys who demean their wives, who become demanding, maybe even damaging, or distant sometimes, but destructive either way. But God's man actively loves his wife. The last thing he would do would be to hurt her. He celebrates her unique gifts as a woman. Listen to the call to service here in this kind of leadership. He leads well by delegating decisions and duties to her that she is better at. Because, by the way, your wife may be far better than you at organizing or doing the finances. You should delegate to her gladly. But she should know this. that you do that out of honor to her and out of humility, not because you're just passive and lazy. A godly leader recognizes his wife's strengths then, and he does all he can to help her grow in grace, grow in grace as a fellow heir of the grace of life. You're equal. He advances her at his own expense, the way Christ loved the church by giving himself up for her, Ephesians chapter 5. He puts her needs ahead of his own. And so he provides for her, he protects her, he defends her, he shows her how much he cherishes her as a gift from God. And so that means he is not demanding, because he realizes that even one beautiful day with his wife is more than he ever deserved. That's what it means to be a manly leader. It takes initiative, it takes courage, and it takes humility. The devil will do all he can to defeat you because he hates it when he sees humility. I don't really care who makes the decisions in your family. That's a matter of gifting. But I do say that when things in a family are drifting in an ungodly direction, it should not be the woman who has to blow the whistle and call a timeout. Think about David taking on Goliath. David knew it wasn't right to let a boastful giant get away with mocking the living God. And so David, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And he says, "Hey, army, is everybody deaf? This isn't right. Who is this lumbering blabbermouth who does he think he is? And don't you guys know who you are? You're God's army. You're the army of the living God. Goliath cannot defeat you. Let me show you how." And of course, that involves taking risks, because it might mean being a David who had to go it alone with his sling and his stones. But we men are all asked to become dangerous. Dangerous to the devil, who wants to destroy us so that he can get to our family. And so we must take to heart what James tells us in James 4. If you will resist the devil, then he will run away from you. Will you be that man who moves boldly with the truth and forces the devil into a retreat? Will you be that man? Where are you, Adam? And that leads to Paul's fourth command, because so many of us men think, well, this is too much for me. I cannot do this. In fact, I don't really want to do things that I can't do perfectly. Okay. You will not do this perfectly. And sometimes you will fail. And sometimes once too often. But you don't have to stay weak. So here's number 4. Grow strong. Rise to the challenge. God's man knows where to get his strength. And it takes extra strength to stay alert in the middle of the watch. It takes more strength than we have to stand true to our convictions. It takes the power of God to repel the powers of darkness and take actions that our family and our church and our community need. And so that's why we fail so often, because in our pride, we have tried to operate without divine help, without praying, without really depending on God, without searching the scriptures to find out what our life really should be about. And so like David later in his life, when he's the king, he stumbles badly. Murder, adultery, the Bathsheba story. Lots of guilt and grief. When we read that story, we know you can be strong in God at one point and then become weak. But all praise to God, it can go the other way. Adam again, he went along with his wife and he meekly ate the fruit when he knew it was wrong. And then he blamed her for it, and really he was blaming God. It was the woman you gave me. If you'd given me a better woman, I would not have failed. If only my wife were better, then we wouldn't have all these problems. If only the women would rise up, we would have a great church. No, this was just a man discovering for the first time how weak he can be without God. He had to learn what every man must learn. He will always fail without the Lord. You can say, well, yeah, I don't have enough strength to be God's man. And you don't. God never designed you to fight the battle without him. Now, maybe that's a big secret to becoming a man whom God can use. Not that you are a person of unusual power, but you have discovered how weak you are, and you quit pretending that you don't need the Lord. That's a man of unusual honesty. And so what he also discovers is that he has immense hidden resources that are available only through humble prayer. Let me pass on one of my favorite stories When I go to Liberia, I get to tell all the stories that I love most, and I come back and I have a new audience every time there. But here, you got to hear them more than once, but here you go. The story is about a guy named Bob. And, well, he was a simple insurance salesman in Washington, D.C. He wasn't a Christian until he met a guy named Doug Coe, who loved to tell any man, about the life they can have in Jesus Christ. I've met Doug Coe, and that's what he's all about. Well, one day, Bob came to Doug all excited about something that he had found reading his Bible. It's where Jesus said, "Ask whatever you will in my name, and you will receive it." And he says, "Wow, is that really true?" And Doug explained, "Well, I mean, it's not exactly a blank check, but yeah, it is true. Jesus really does answer prayer." "Well, great," Bob said. "Then I'm going to start praying for something. I think I'll pray for Africa." Well, Doug thought about that and said, "Well, you know, that's kind of a broad target. Once you narrow it down at least to just one country." And he says, "Okay, then I'll pray for Kenya." "Well, do you know anyone in Kenya?" Doug asked. "Well, no." "Have you ever been to Kenya?" "No." He just wanted to pray for Kenya. Well, Doug wanted to motivate this young prayer, so that he challenged Bob. He said, "You know, if you are serious, then I want you to pray for Kenya every day for 6 months. And if by the end of that time nothing extraordinary has happened, then I'll pay you $500. So Bob started to pray, and for a while, of course, nothing happened. But then one night, Bob was at a dinner in Washington, and he was at a table where people were explaining what they do, and there was a lady there that helped run an orphanage in Kenya, the largest of its kind. And Bob sat up. I mean, he came alive. He asked this woman question after question, and then she said, "Well, you're obviously interested in my country. Have you been to Kenya before?" He said, "Well, no." "Do you know anyone in Kenya?" "Well, no." "Then how do you happen to be so curious?" And he said, "Well, someone challenged me to start praying, and there's $500. Oh, never mind." Well, she asked Bob to come to Kenya and visit the orphanage. So Bob was eager to go. He'd have left that very night if he could have. And when Bob got to Kenya, he was shocked by the poverty that was there and the lack of health care. And as soon as he got back to Washington, he began to write to large pharmaceutical companies, describing the vast need he had seen. And he reminded them that they often have large quantities of medical supplies that went unsold. And, you know, why don't you send them to this place I saw in Kenya? And some of them did. And the orphanage soon received more than $1 million worth of medical supplies. And the woman called up Bob and said, "This is amazing. I mean, we've had the most phenomenal gifts because of the letters you wrote. We'd like you to fly here because we're going to have a party. We're going to celebrate it. We want you to be there." And so Bob flew back to Kenya. And while he was there, the president of Kenya came to the celebration because this was, you know, the largest orphanage in the country. And he offered to take Bob on a tour of the capital city, Nairobi. In the course of the tour, they visited a prison. And Bob asked about a group of prisoners there. "Oh, they're political prisoners," he was told. "Well, that's a bad idea," Bob said immediately. "You should let them out." Well, Bob finished the tour. He flew back home, and Bob received a little phone call from the State Department of the U.S. government. "Is this Bob?" "Yeah." "Were you recently in Kenya?" "Yeah." "Did you happen to make any statements to the president of Kenya about political prisoners?" Uh-huh. "What did you say?" "I told him he should let them free." And then the State Department official explained how that department had been quietly working for years to get the release of those prisoners, but now the prisoners had been released. And the State Department had been told that it was largely because of Bob. So the government was calling to say thank you. Several months later, the president of Kenya made a phone call to Bob. He was going to rearrange his government and appoint a new cabinet, and he wondered if he would be willing to fly and pray with him for 3 days while he worked on this crucial task. And so Bob, he wasn't politically connected that in America or anywhere, he boarded a plane again for Kenya, where he prayed and asked God to give wisdom for the leader of that nation to select a new government. And all this happened because one man got on his knees and found strength for a plan bigger than he was. God is looking for Bobs. Many will pray and follow the road that brings, even if it boggles their minds. This is strength. But now I have to ask a crucial question, and it has to do with motives. Who is all this strength for? Is it for you to feel like a big man, to be a heavy hitter, mover, shaker, or whatever, so you can make a name for yourself, so people will admire you, look up to you as the guy who made a big impact on the world? Well, here's the final challenge from Paul. Do all with love. Do all with love. Put others first. Your greatness is in your lowliness, your service, what we learned in the last verses of our little passage today. Paul says your strength is for others. And so you have to reject the lie that you are the focus of everything. Like when the devil came to Adam, he wanted to dangle before him and to Eve, you will be as gods. What comes when you reject that, you say, this life is not just about me. Then that comes to the learning of tenderness, like that of Jesus, where the same hands that whipped away the money changers wiped away a tear from a widow's eye, caressed a child's cheek, made her know she was loved. Ultimately, the true tenderness that I'm talking about requires sacrifice, selfless service, putting yourself aside so that others can flourish. It's part of the manhood that Adam missed. When Eve failed, Adam did not have to go along with that. She ate, but he didn't have to. He could have responded to her failure with love and do the very thing that Jesus would someday have to do because Adam didn't. Adam could have stayed sinless through obedience and volunteered to die in Eve's place, the innocent for the guilty. But Adam chickened out, not have that spirit of sacrifice. He would not be the hero that his wife needed. How much we need men who will see their role in their marriage and their church and their community with the eyes of Jesus. To stay in their marriage even when it's not fun anymore because of love, out of love. Or when parent feels over their head, parenting, stays faithful because he loves them, out of love. Or when work is crushing him and because, he's overworked and underpaid, he won't let that beat him because his family's depending on him. It's out of love. When his church is going through difficulties, he doesn't stop praying and giving, out of love. When his children let him down, he picks them up, out of love. And so here he is, 2 touchdowns down with 5 minutes to play and both ankles broken, but he gets them wrapped and he bears down. He never gives up because people out there are depending on him. That sacrifice, that's the heart of a champion. It's a man who puts himself on the line because of love. God's looking for men who know how to love. Will you be that man? Adam, where are you? Here's the takeaway. Do a personal inventory. Evaluate yourself. How are you doing? If you come up short, you're certainly not alone. We have to help each other do better. We heard a lot about this at men's breakfast yesterday. Evaluate your husband. How is he doing? Honestly. Can't help but hear this message, and if you're a woman, and say, ooh, wait a minute. Maybe you're the wife you would love to have a man like this, but the man you have falls short. That's going to be true of maybe most of us. Does he stand watch? Well, he usually sits down to watch. That's how he watches TV. Standing firm, well, she sees him having pretty fuzzy convictions, more like opinions that are really not founded on the Bible. Act like a male. He acts more like, a mule who stubbornly insists he's always right. Or a man who is strong. Well, he pretends to be strong, but he's really insecure. He constantly needs to be reassured and admired. And this is a man who knows how to love. I don't know. He usually just puts himself first, and he expects to be served by his wife and kids, and he gets mad if they don't. Maybe you're not impressed by what you see in your husband, and he may never change, even after hearing a sermon like this. Or maybe you are impressed with your husband when you hear this, but you really should be impressed by someone else, by a champion who far exceeds the best husband you could have had. And this champion will always sustain you. And I'm sorry if I might have somehow given the impression that having great husbands and dads is what the greatness of a church or a family or even a country depends on ultimately, because it does not. Because men, in the end, look, our sufficiency will not come down to us, but will rest on the shoulders of a champion who exceeds us all. It is he alone who can fulfill the need of our people, to fully restore the heart of our family, of our church, of our community. Do you know him? You got to know him. He is constantly watching, on high alert. Let's put it this way. Do you know him? He stands watch. He never slumbers or sleeps. No enemy slips past him. No danger fools him. He prays for you. Do you know him? He stands firm. He keeps every promise. He fulfills every prophecy. He is repelling the enemy. He never gives ground, and he never gives up. And he will never leave you or forsake you. Do you know him? He takes action. Even now, he is a man's man, the ultimate man. He is there to save people, to be his eternal bride. Initiative. He doesn't wait for us to come to him because we never would. He comes to us seeking and saving those who are lost. Do you know him? He is incredibly strong. He taps into infinite resources of heaven to complete his mission. And so he comes on a white horse, making war, his eyes a flame of fire, clothed in a robe dipped in blood, with the armies of heaven thundering behind him. On white horses, on his robe and on his thigh will be written, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Even so come, Lord Jesus. Do you know him? And above all, he does all of this with love. The sacrifice of a truly tender heart. And his name is Jesus Christ. You know who I'm talking about. But do you know him? He supplies strength for the weak. He's available for the tempted and the tried. He sympathizes and he forbears. He guards and he guides. He heals and he forgives. He's the one who protects the widows and the fatherless. He is the one who serves the handicapped. He's the one that remembers the old people, even when everyone else forgets. He's the one who lifts little children on his lap to bless them. And at the cross, he proved his love by dying. Who of us would even die for a righteous man? But he died for us when we were still sinners, for us, his pitifully weak and ungodly enemies. Do you know him? And if not, men, you could never be like him. He is not only your standard, but he is your strength. But if you do know him, then I tell you, then you can learn what Paul had to learn and what he did learn, who had that same weaknesses, all the weaknesses we do. But he could say, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That is my call to you, my brothers. Be strong in the Lord, in the power of his might. Let's pray. We who are weak need you. We need you, dear God, and your dear Son. We are not enough to lead, engage the battle. We are not truly the warriors that we need to be unless we bow our knee to you. We want to be stronger. Show us our strength in Christ your Son. As we worship, as we remind ourselves how much you are to be admired, we humble ourselves and we quiet ourselves, because from this rich worship experience comes the possibility of true growth. We commit ourselves to honor you. Help us, Lord. In Christ, our Savior.